Neon Green Network begrüßt den Verkehrswissenschaftler Dr. Harald Frey.
Ladies and gentlemen, I would also like to warmly welcome you. Enjoy the evening. The public space actually always is a political space, a room for integration, for exchange, communication, where trade and business is being effected, but also where children learn how to ride their bikes, where they take the first steps. And when we look at public space, looking at how it changed over the past, we have to say and admit, and I personally come from the field of transport and traffic planning, since transport planning has been taking its weirdest steps in our public space. It has created some places where you move fast, where those being slow are marginalized, pushed aside, technically deformed, regulated. That actually doesn't have anything to do anymore with the area, the rooms we learned to know in the past. When looking at the historical cities, we have to say, when we, for instance, walk around in Venice or in Vienna, in other historical cities, it's some public space that got into existence long before transport planning having qualities we start seeking for again. So what went wrong? What we appreciate so much when it is about the diversity, the efficiency, the space that is manageable, can be put in a nutshell saying what we would refer to as the benchmark human beings. That is something that happened before machines were used to a large extent, before we started moving construction masses using concrete, earth walls, and other barriers, for instance. So you can see that we have more than 60,000 years of experience with these structures. So we can see they have stood the test. So when you look at Vienna, you can see the secession here in the back, an area that looks quite differently today than in the 19th century, depicted here in the picture. We are confronted with something that reminds us of some design that in future will make us experience more and more what we miss today. You can see there are pedestrians walking around, there are broader pedestrian walks, we have a public network of transport on the surface, and it is about the structure that when we move in makes us identify with the environs. When we raise the question of who did the city belong to and who does it belong to today, the answer, the picture to this question has undergone fundamental changes. Some 60, 70 years ago, the question was quite clearly answered. The public space belonged to the children, because the children took possession of the public area, the public space, turning it into the places they played in. They started riding their bikes, where they could observe the adults imitate their activities. A classical space of learning, of testing, of practicing activities without any specific regulation or control. Today, when we send our children this way into the streets, this is what it will look like from the point of view of children. This is what they identify. Some kind of barriers, hurdles, traffic lights, more and more hurdles being set up. We turned our children's living space into structures that do no longer focus on any humane aspects. Look at the Reichsbrücke, our famous bridge in the 50s, for instance. On the left-hand side, you can see that the vehicle of public transport fulfill our needs much more than today. You can see there are many pedestrians walking around, bikers having enough space, and we have an above-ground transport means fulfilling our needs. Where would we find the pedestrians today? Put under the bridge. When at the horizon of the bridge you used to see the St. Stephen's Cathedral, people knew this is my city. The structure, the transport system quite clearly sharpened the point of view of a city, and this will be enforced according to how the infrastructure is designed. And when you look at the hinterland and the little streets, the alleys, I have to say that the pictures that were very clear back then came from human beings. And when we look at the windows, for instance, you can see they were all open, opening into the street. There was no aspect of noise or exhaust fumes that made people quickly shut their windows again, having the windows on the backyard side opened rather instead of those facing the street. So fundamental changes, thus also the city aspects changed. We created a transport system that is almost incompatible with the old structures of the city that stood the test for so many centuries. And you can see what the changes were like at the St. Stephen's Cathedral or at Schwarzenberg Square, for instance. Public transport was affected immediately, and also the unmotorized transport. Meanwhile, we again started repairing things slowly but surely. What was even more drastic, besides infrastructure, was the so-called transport education. And education brings about some negative touch because you see that people try to influence the vis-a-vis. In German, the word is Erziehung, which has to do with pulling along. Literally translated into English, you can't make that comparison between the English and the German word. Education is a milder word, but people were used to teach children in a very strict way, saying children no longer were to play in the streets. They should be locked up in the flats, the apartments. Obedience, being obedient. It was a structure of fast means of transport. We were all being taught that today. We take it as something that is obvious for us to just stop when the traffic lights turn red. Children learn how to be watchful. They are to make sure to show a kind of obedience when it is about walking in streets where there's transport and we have masses of steel. So you can see we've established structures that hardly have anything to do with our actual needs, our needs of mobility. And you can see that this technical deformation and its repercussions every day. Do you really want to ride your bike in such structures? Do you want to take a walk, a stroll, where you have to register when you want to pay a visit to your friend at the other side of the street, where you're allowed to cross the street, provided the cars want to give way to you? So structures that have nothing to do with any place worth living in for human beings, any livable structures or environs. Artists have a very strong and clear-cut focus, a bit exaggerating maybe something we intuitively may feel, but we don't dare speak out loudly. And these examples show what we don't want to see when we keep pets, keeping them in cages. However, putting that up as a standard for children is one of the best examples for our absurd and weird values in our society. And you can see the word freedom being put onto this cage here. This again shows what our values really are in society. You can see the car is not locked up in the cage. It can move around freely. The children are locked up. So these are still the values prevailing in our society. I think slowly but surely we do get more awareness for this distortion, but it's not really discussed on a broad level, not by our politicians. So what will happen when that human behavior is cut off with our pedestrian walks, with the lanes? You can see when looking at history how people used to move around in a city. It's about the social ties, our relationships. If I cut them, they are transversal to the lane and not longitudinal, because the houses and the people live at the two sides of the street. Then I will not have so many friends or acquaintances anymore, which is quite clear, because if I can't reach out to my friend on the other side of the street because there is a death zone in between the two of us, I either try to find a friend somewhere else, and should I fail to reach out to anyone else, our people will get more and more lonely. But these are the empirical data stemming back to the 80s, where on the right-hand side, for instance, you can see the number of friendships and acquaintances being established and the number of cars. Empirical data and repeated investigations dating back to the 80s, at the beginning of the year 2000, have been repeated. The number of friends, of acquaintances will diminish, the more cars will rush through a city. A very clear-cut story. So I create certain structures that will determine people's behavior, not only in our commuters' connections and in our normal transport areas, but all over the city. It doesn't have to do anything with the fact that this is one lane where I move with one vehicle from A to B. What's so nice about spatial urban planning is that this is some transversal science. The activities will have an effect on our economic system, on culture, on many different levels. Also, when it comes to our purchasing structures, you can do your shopping this way, in a very efficient way, concerning sustainable and future-oriented, resource-benign ways, or this way. You find these structures all over the cities, and the question is what structures will accompany us more in the future, and what structures will we want to focus on in future. This is another typical street in Vienna, again, where you may say today, well, not very imaginative, not lots of things going on. You see the flats, parking space, not much going on, no shop structures, quite boring. Let's now look at the city in the 1930s. Here you can see over a distance of some 250 meters more than 30 shops. Small structures, small scales. You can see there is a restaurant, there is a grocery store. So the changes in our transport system certainly also bring about a tremendous change in our economic structures, going away from manageable sizes to very large structures. There is a nice doctoral thesis on this topic at our university concerning the cross-section of a city in 1910 and 2014. As a comparison, you can see green wherever there used to be shops. In blue, you can also see the cars, for instance. This is the way the city presents itself today. And the parked car, the standing transport here, is one of the parameters not only determining public space, but also going into the buildings, into the backyards, the formerly protected zones of the buildings, with enormous repercussions, as you can see. But, and I was particularly asked to not only give you a gloomy picture, but also share some positive examples with you that we have plenty of, with enormous changes brought about not only in Vienna, but also in Paris, London, Berlin, Munich, you name the cities. Going away from old structures based on the idea that car transport does not really fit our urban structures, attempting to repair the mistakes made in the past. The St. Stephen's Square in the 50s, and at the same point of view, a picture taken today. So we try to make sure to do away with our mistakes, making sure that life comes into the cities again. The vitality of a city has lots to do with the question of what room we provide for transport, for public life, and so on and so forth. This is a typical crossing in Vienna. I'm not telling you what street it is. In the last 2 years, it was hotly debated and discussed in Vienna. This is what it looks like today, quite different, as you can see. Fewer cars, more people, thus more wallets, more possibilities, more options for business. This is a typical regeneration process of a city, getting away from the idea of approaching a city like this towards a conception of public space that looks like this picture. And this shows us what steps we'll have to take in the future when we talk about growing cities, about the fact that more people come into the cities again. It's about learning, understanding, and effectively and efficiently dealing with technical tools, the cars being just one of them. Using cars only up to 5% of today's volume, for instance. And this entails new qualities we bring back into cities. How will I transport goods? What hubs will I need? What will my infrastructure look like? So this is some new way of understanding public space that temporarily will have to meet the demands again, making sure that squares where people use to gather during the weekend, for instance, can be used for these functions again. When you temporarily do it once or twice, you very quickly can work with these pictures, showing to the people, signaling them how we can meet these demands, not only once a year. I already mentioned this afternoon in our discussion when walking through Schleifmühlgasse in Vienna, there were these blue containers where you can see that we have a transport system today making sure that nature was turned into some faraway concept, because when nature is accessible, we today tend to seal these areas. Where our space is left, where we can get into contact with nature, it's being pushed aside to a few lanes only. Here again, public space being used in a different way as a place for encounter, for communication, as a political space. Looking at the back of this picture, you can see that something's wrong down there, because when we have vacancies, for instance, and we prevent that this is going to turn into a permanent situation, something's going wrong. In Vienna, we have some 10,000 empty garage spaces in buildings that were erected, established, and now are vacant, and the same in our public space. But as long as the car is automatically linked with usage like living or doing my shopping, when I go down to the garage in my elevator, any alternative will not be plausible in my head. Because why should I get out my bike from the cellar? Why should I go 300 meters to the next stop, the next station of public transport, when it's so convenient to go to my car and again to find some parking space at my destination? So combining and linking living, parking, working, parking, and doing my shopping and parking is one of the major challenges, the issues to be solved today. Because you can easily imagine, as soon as the structures are erected, you hardly have any chances whatsoever to start repairing any things that went wrong. And when this is the public space, at the same time, where will you find the shops? You can see we have 2 meters 10 in the basements here. You can't put any shop in there. It will always be the entry into a garage until the house will be demolished again. So we have not reached our targets yet fully. So the direction to take and transport planning partly has just negated that. It's about qualities. And quality can be measured in a very difficult way. 10 minutes sitting in a doctor's office may be endless, and 10 minutes in some nice wood where you take a stroll may be over in a second, you feel. So this is some subjective experience of time. The quality of the environment will determine our feelings, the time, speed, the distance. In a nice environment, we will be more willing to somehow walk a certain distance. When I have a public space that is designed this way, meeting the needs of bikers, of pedestrians, with shadows in between, it's quite different some public space, as you can easily say when making comparisons to structures like these, for instance. And you can see that the transport system and its velocity will control what the structures look like, how they are being perceived by people. Just having a straight line is one of the silliest elements of planning. Why? We talked about that before, because we wouldn't find that in nature, and if so, only over very short distances. So what's wide, what's far away, what's near? These are terms you may define quite easily yourselves when it's about what is far away, as far as I can throw a stone, and what's near me, anything I can easily accomplish with my 3-4 kilometers of walking distance. And 200-300 meters, or the width, the length of a stone I throw, is the measure the spatial planners, urban planners should have in mind. Because of speed, however, I need different radiuses here of curves, for instance. And the question may be, what does this have to do with human beings, and what feelings will be triggered by that when we perceive public space? So the benchmark of human beings, which may be some abstract term, for some will get more concrete features when we look at the quality issue. When I go away from the transport system, it's about the design of facades, about greening, about smaller sizes, which again will be determined by the parameters of our transport and traffic system. By way of conclusion, I would like to raise a couple of questions we, the urban planners, should focus on more and more in the future, that will have an essential component in our planning. How will we use our public space in cities? How are we going to design transport zones and areas? And what will we perceive, in what way, and how will we discuss these things? That bring me to the last question of who plans the planning. Very often you travel around and you will ask yourself, who did that planning? Who planned it? You have the biker, but here the pedestrian should be able to cross the street as well. No one knows their way around anymore. You have many, many signs and posts and markings on the roads, for instance, and you don't know your way anymore. So we all see something's gone wrong here, because otherwise we wouldn't have to raise this question at all. So this is the issue of planning as such. The way we plan, or what's in our heads, will determine our structures. Ultimately, when you implement a plan, when you start constructing something like a highway, for instance, it will have repercussions on our behavior. And in transport, there will be further repercussions. We do our shopping in shopping centers. We use lots of energy because the energy backpack of a product will be determined by how I take it back the last mile from the shop. So who is in charge of planning? The planner. And the planner has his or her brain. And now the issue is that when you have a certain set of values, of ideas in your brain, because, for instance, the person who would only think of cars, it's quite clear that we finally will only see structures that focus on cars. When you do your planning with planners who have the cars in their heads only, the final result will not be very smart. And this is of great importance. This is decisive, because the windscreen perspective is a different one than the one you would have when you sit on your bike or when you take a walk. It's important to know all of these perspectives, to also know what your values are prevailing in your lives. I also know all the perspectives. I know what will be of benefit for the city and what not. When you are a doctor, for instance, doing surgery, you shouldn't be afraid of cutting into the flesh, for instance, because as a planner, you have to make sure to always measure the situation of the organism. So there is this wide range of needs of human beings, and wherever we create opportunities to take possession of this free space, it will happen, because it will not only happen on Maria-Hilfer-Straße shortly before midnight, but also at various other spots and places of our cities where public space again will be given back to the pedestrians, to the bikers. So let's be courageous enough to admit to having created structures that are not sustainable, that do not fulfill our future needs. And let's try to imitate the Seoul example with some 200,000 vehicles going in a street that was torn down because the mayor thought if he took money into his hands for repairing this old and obsolete highway, it would not be sustainable. So he had it torn down without creating any capacities in the environment, setting up a rapid bus system, setting free the locked up river again, increasing the quality of life for the many citizens. Thank you very much for listening. I hope it was a good presentation for you. Thank you very much for your attention.
Herr Dr. Frey, was mich noch
Mr. Frey, I would be interested in learning more about how many of these structures can be somehow be taken back again, and how can we focus on human beings again in our urban planning? We'll be able to achieve that aim. Yes, certainly, we will do that step by step. It could happen more quickly, but I will need some decades to rearrange, to reorganize a city. But it's important to create this commitment, not only on paper, but also in practice. How difficult it is on one side to formulate targets that partly will be locked up in drawers, but something you will commit yourself to, and we do see some gap here. But one more important question I would like to raise. Do you think, when we take Vienna as an example, would you say that the majority of the people would agree with you saying that you want to do planning that is not in full justice with cars? You, for instance, made reference to the Maria-Hilfer-Straße. I think Maria Vasilako would have jumped out of the window of the town hall when it was about getting people's agreement. Do you think most of the people would like to get the cars out of the cities? For most people, it's not about taking cars out of the cities. They want to have a city that's livable, that's worth living in. When you ask people what their aims are, they talk about green space, about bikers lanes, about biking infrastructure, and some nice and safe environment. What people don't want to have is exhaust fumes, noise, insecure an environment. It's not about the process for the people, but about the targets, the aims you have to clearly define. And what's also quite clear in this process is when I have an equation with 4 variables, the politician, administration, planning, and the media. And should anywhere in this equation with a multiplication involved, when I suddenly have a 0, any null or void, it will be the same in the end. So I need 1 in order to make sure to be successful ultimately. So everyone has to pull in concert. And with the Maria-Hilfer-Straße, it was torpedoed. We know that, no question. But in the city of Vienna, in the last 20 years, there haven't been any major pedestrian walks established. What we used to do before always had to do with construction sites where car transport for a couple of years was taken off the surface anyway. So this was the first real interference in a dimension of some running organism that stood its test. And it's with this knowledge in the background that we in future will be able to accomplish many, many things. Thank you. Cool.